The prairie smelled of ash and iron. Dawn crept over the horizon like a weary outlaw, its light spilling across the ruins of battlefield. Smoke rose in thin, uncertain ribbons from the blackened ground, carrying with it the whisper of last night's slaughter. Corpses lay twisted in the grass, men who had shouted their final oaths before the silence took them. A lone soldier walked among them. His boots sank into mud darkened by blood, and every step seemed heavier than the last. His rifle hung across his back, but in his hands he carried a blade dull by use, the steel notched and scarred. He had long since stopped counting the men it had cut down. What mattered more was the emptiness inside him, a silence that echoed louder than the cannons ever had. He lifted his eyes toward the far ridge where the sun broke, its light falling not kindly but with the cold indifference of judgment. His uniform marked him as an American, though his face, lined with dust and grief, could have belonged to any man hollowed out by war. He told himself he kept walking because there was no other choice. Yet in truth, he was looking for something. Though whether it was death, redemption, or simply a reason to breathe, he could not say. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Not the nervous dart of a scavenger bird, not the shift of wind in tall grass. Something human. He stopped, breath held, and narrowed his gaze. Across the scarred plain, among the remnants of wagons splintered into jagged bones, stood a figure. At first he thought the battlefield had conjured a vision to taunt him, the way memory sometimes sharpened until it felt like presence. But then the figure stepped forward, and the light proved her real. She was young, though her face carried the shadows of old grief. Her hair spilled wild in the wind, dark against the pale sky. In her hand she carried a sword, an ancient weapon gleaming where sunlight kissed the edge. It looked almost too heavy for her, yet she held it with steadiness that spoke of long practice, of survival carved from necessity. For a heartbeat, he simply watched. She moved with a grace he had never seen among soldiers. Each step was deliberate, her body balanced, her gaze sharp. She was not scavenging. She was hunting. When her eyes found him, the world seemed to tighten. She froze, the sword lowering fractionally, not out of fear but calculation. Then, without a word, she advanced. He felt his pulse rise, though not entirely from danger. Something about her presence unsettled him, the way beauty and violence lived side by side in her face. He drew his blade, the sound of steel unsheathing loud against the hush of dawn. They met in the middle of the plain, where the bodies thinned but the blood still stained the dirt. She struck first, the sword a flash of silver arcing toward his ribs. He caught it with his blade, the clash ringing through his arm. Sparks scattered. She pivoted, quick as breath, her next strike low, aimed for his legs. He stepped back, dirt grinding beneath his boots, and countered with a thrust meant to test her guard. Steel sang again. It was no ordinary fight. Each movement carried something heavier than survival. She fought with fury, her strikes fierce and unrelenting, yet her eyes burned with more than anger. There was sorrow there, too, the kind that bled into every swing, turning grief into sharpened will. He found himself answering in kind, not with reckless rage, but with the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. Their blades locked, faces inches apart, breath mingling. He smelled dust and rain on her skin, the raw edge of battle clinging to her. Her gaze did not waver. Neither did his. A sudden twist broke them apart, and she slashed high. The strike grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric, drawing blood. Pain burned, sharp and hot. He retaliated with a sweeping cut that forced her back 2 steps, her boots dragging furrows into the mud. Yet she did not falter. She came again, her sword raised in both hands, driving down with a cry that split the silence. He caught the blow, their blades crashing together with a force that rattled bone. For an instant, the world narrowed to that point of contact. Steel grinding, muscle straining, eyes locked in a silent war. Then he shoved, breaking free. They circled. The prairie wind stirred the grass around them, carrying the smell of storm. Thunder murmured far away, as though the sky itself watched their struggle with grim patience. She lunged. He sidestepped, parried, and their weapons tangled. This time, when they broke apart, both stood bleeding, her lip split, his arm cut deep. Neither looked away. He felt something strange rising inside him, something he had not felt in years. Not anger, not hate. It was recognition, as if the emptiness inside him had finally met its reflection in another. The clash slowed. Their movements grew deliberate, less about killing, more about understanding. Each strike tested, each parry measured. She was not just an enemy. She was a question he could not yet answer. Finally, they broke apart once more, breath ragged, bodies trembling from exertion. A single yard of silence stretched between them, heavy as a canyon. He gripped his blade, ready if she came again, but she did not move. Instead, she lowered her sword, only slightly, her eyes still locked on his. The look she gave him was not mercy. It was challenge, a silent vow that this was not finished. The soldier said nothing. Words felt too fragile for the moment. Blood dripped from his arm into the dirt, mixing with the stains already there. The prairie wind lifted dust between them, veiling her face until only her eyes remained visible, sharp and unyielding. Then, as the thunder rolled closer, she stepped back. 1 pace. 2. Her sword remained ready, but she did not strike. She turned slightly, as if the storm itself had called her away. He watched her retreat, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. The battlefield around him was littered with the dead. Yet for the first time he felt alive. He could not name what had passed between them, only that it had changed the silence inside him. When she vanished into the haze of smoke and dust, he stood alone once more. The wind moaned across the plain, carrying with it the promise that their paths had only begun to cross. The soldier wiped blood from his arm, sheathed his blade, and turned toward the horizon. For the first time in years, he wanted to keep walking, not to escape, but to find her again. The storm came fast, rolling over the plains with the hunger of a pack animal. Black clouds dragged across the sky, swallowing the last pale fire of dusk. The soldier felt the air shift, the dry crackle before rain, the sting of charged wind on his skin. He pulled his coat tighter as the first drops fell, heavy as coins, splattering against the dirt already darkened by blood. He searched for shelter. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by the skeleton of a burned-out homestead crouched against a ridge. Its walls leaned crooked, but they still stood. He pushed through the storm toward it, boots sinking in the mud, until the doorway swallowed him in shadow. Inside smelled of smoke and rot. The roof sagged, rafters split, but the walls cut the wind. He leaned against one, catching his breath. Rain drummed on the roof, seeping through cracks and thin, uneven streams. He thought he was alone, until he heard the scrape of steel. She was already there. The girl stood in the far corner, sword in hand, face lit by the lightning that split the sky through the broken boards. Her eyes burned as they had on the battlefield, steady and sharp. She had chosen the same refuge, and neither of them had known until now. For a moment they did not move. The storm filled the silence between them, thunder rumbling like a giant's breath. He raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but to show he carried no blade in them. His knife hung at his belt, his rifle still slung across his back, but he made no motion for them. She did not lower her sword. The soldier's voice came rough, warmed by smoke and silence. "Storm won't pass soon. Best we stay dry." The girl's eyes narrowed, measuring him. She said nothing. Her silence cut deeper than a shout. He reached into his coat and drew a canteen, unscrewing the cap. He drank, then set it carefully on the floor between them, a gesture without words. If she wanted, she could take it, or kill him while his hand lingered close. For several heartbeats, she didn't move. Then, slow as shadow, she stepped forward. Her blade stayed ready, angled toward him, but she bent enough to lift the canteen. She drank, her throat working in the flicker of lightning, then tossed it back at his feet. The echo of tin against wood rang louder than thunder. They remained opposite each other, separated by less than the length of a man's stride, yet by more than a lifetime of mistrust. Rain poured harder. It slipped through the broken roof, running down the soldier's arm, washing thin trails of blood from his wound. He pressed a rag against it, wincing. The girl's gaze dropped to the wound, lingered, then lifted again. Her face did not soften, but her silence carried awareness. Hours passed with only the storm speaking. Firelight would have been comfort, but neither dared strike a spark in the ruined house, not with both watching for weakness. They sat across from one another, eyes never straying far. He leaned against the wall, exhaustion dragging at his body. She crouched, sore across her knees, ready even in stillness. When at last the thunder eased, he spoke again. His voice carried weight, as though each word was pried from stone. I fought too many battles with men who didn't know why they raised their weapons. You fight different. Every strike had reason. Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. She tilted her head, rainwater dripping from her hair. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was low, carrying both steel and sorrow. Reason doesn't keep the dead alive. He met her gaze, and the silence after her words was heavier than the storm. She told him nothing else. Not yet, but in her tone, in the way her grip tightened on the sword, he heard the echo of loss. Someone had been taken from her. A family, a people. He did not ask further. He knew the weight of ghosts well enough. The storm broke fully past midnight. Wind rattled the boards. Rain fell in torrents. Lightning bared the ruins like bones. In the flicker, they looked less like enemies and more like mirrors. Both young enough to remember love. Both old enough in spirit to know only war. At one point, she rose and crossed the room. His hand tightened on his knife, but she did not attack. Instead, she leaned against the opposite wall, closer now, her shadow stretching toward his. For a heartbeat, they stood only a few feet apart, the storm raging around them. The soldier could feel the heat of her presence, sharp as the blade she carried. They did not speak again until dawn. The rain slowed to a drizzle, gray light leaking through the cracks in the boards. The soldier pushed himself up, shoulders aching. The girl stood already, sword in hand. Neither had slept, though both bore the exhaustion of it. At the doorway, she paused, rain dripping from her chin. She turned to him, eyes cutting into his like a blade. The storm gave you a night. Her meaning was clear. A night of mercy. A night to breathe. A night to live. He nodded once, the only acknowledgement he could give. Words would have broken the fragile truce. She stepped out into the gray dawn. The soldier followed, though not too close. On the battlefield, they had been enemies. In the storm, they had been uneasy shadows of something else, companions, if only by necessity. Outside, the land steamed beneath the rising sun. Mud gleamed where blood had dried, the prairie stretching endless again. The storm had scoured the earth clean, yet it had not erased what lay beneath. She turned once, sword glinting in the pale light. Her eyes met his. There was no smile, no farewell, only the promise of another meeting, one that would not end in shelter, but in blood. Then she walked away, her figure shrinking against the horizon, until the land swallowed her whole. The soldier stood in the mud, the storm's chill still clinging to him. He touched the cut on his arm, now bound tight, and let the silence return. Yet the silence was different now. Not empty, but alive, charged with the weight of her voice, her presence, her vow. He should have felt relief that she was gone. Instead, he felt the pull of her absence, like a wound he could not close. The land breathed, wide and endless, carrying the smell of rain and iron. Somewhere ahead, she walked with her blade, and he knew the path of his life had already bent toward hers. The storm had passed, but the war between them had only just begun. The prairie still smelled of rain, though the sky had already burned back to its harsh blue. The soldier walked steady, following the tracks she left across the damp earth. He had no plan but one, to find her again. Some part of him knew he should have turned away, let her vanish into the horizon like smoke. Yet his body betrayed him. Each step carried him closer, as if the storm had carved a path meant only for the two of them. He found her at dusk. She stood at the edge of a ravine, her blade resting loose at her side, her hair tangled by the wind. She did not turn when he approached, but he knew she had felt him long before. She always did. "You're following me," she said, voice flat. "Maybe," he answered. "Or maybe the land wants us in the same place." Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp as flint, but before she could reply the sound came, hooves and laughter, cruel and careless, drifting across the open plain. The soldier stiffened, hand moving to his knife. She lifted her head, listening. Outlaws. They came quick, a pack of riders spilling over the ridge, guns slung and blades flashing in the low sun. Their shouts carried hunger, the kind that belonged to men who lived off death. The girl raised her sword. The soldier drew steel from his belt. Whatever bound them, enemy or not, there was no choice now. Survival had chosen for them. The riders thundered down, mud flung up by hooves. The soldier stepped forward, knife gleaming, while she waited, poised, her stance balanced and sure. The first outlaw swung low with a rusted saber. She caught the blade in a ringing clash, steel meeting steel, sparks scattering. In the same heartbeat, the soldier lunged at another rider, dragging him from his horse with brutal force, knife plunging deep into flesh. Blood spattered hot across the dirt. Chaos split open. Horses screamed, men shouted, the air thick with dust and gunpowder. The girl moved like fire, her sword cutting arcs of silver through the smoke. Each strike was precise, fueled by a fury that had no waste. The soldier fought with heavier strokes, his knife a blunt instrument of survival, but together they formed a rhythm neither could deny. Once, he saw her falter, a lance aimed for her back as she turned to strike. Without thought, he drove his shoulder into the attacker, blade carving across the man's throat. She looked back at him, her eyes lit not with gratitude but something sharper, something dangerous. Recognition. They fought until the ground was littered with broken bodies, until the air carried only the groan of dying horses and the rattle of breath. The last outlaw tried to flee, spurring his horse into the ravine, but the girl's arm snapped forward, javelin flying from her grasp. It pierced his back clean through, throwing him from the saddle. Dust rose, then silence. The soldier stood hunched, chest heaving, knife dripping red. She lowered her sword. Blood streaked along her arm, her face pale in the failing light. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, two shadows carved from the same storm. Then the quiet deepened. The battlefield smelled of iron and wet earth. He crouched near a broken wagon, tearing strips from the canvas to bind his arm. When he looked up, she was watching. The fire had left her stance, though her sword remained within reach. "You saved me," he said, voice rough. She tilted her head, expression unreadable. "And you saved me." He gave a short laugh, hollow but real. "Strange world. A day ago we were trying to kill each other." Her eyes narrowed. "A day ago we still are." She crossed to the fire they had sparked from dry brush and flint. The flames painted her face in copper and gold, shadows clinging to the edges. She sat without invitation, her sword across her knees, gaze fixed on the burning wood. He joined her after a moment, the heat biting against his chilled skin. Neither spoke. The crackle of flame, the distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind across the prairie, all spoke for them. He found himself studying her hands, scarred but steady, the way her shoulders never relaxed, as if every breath was taken in defiance. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was quiet, almost lost in the fire's hiss. "You wonder why I fight." He turned toward her. "My people are gone," she said, eyes on the flames. "Taken. Burned out. I fight because if I stop, there's no one left to remember." He felt the words like a blade pressed to his chest. He had his own ghosts, faces he could not bury, names that still woke him the night. For a moment, the fire between them seemed not to separate but to bind, as if their griefs shared the same root. "You carry their memory," he said. She looked at him then, and for the first time her gaze softened, though only by a fraction. "And you? Why do you still walk this land?" He had no answer, or perhaps he had too many. He stared into the fire, searching for truth, and found only the hollow echo of his own survival. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm looking for a reason." Her silence in reply was not cruel. It was understanding. Hours later, when the fire sank low, she rose. She stood tall, her sword sheathed, her face unreadable in the dim light. "If you stand in my way tomorrow," she said, voice steady, "I will kill you." He looked up at her, weary and unflinching. "And if I must kill you," he said, "I'll never forgive myself." The wind rose, scattering embers into night. their sparks twisting like stars before dying in the dirt. She turned away, her figure swallowed by shadow, her footsteps fading into silence. The soldier sat alone by the dying fire. His body ached, but the deeper pain came from the space she left behind. He pressed his palm to the earth, feeling its cold weight, the heartbeat of a land that had seen too much blood. He knew then that their paths would meet again, not as allies, not as enemies, something far more dangerous. He lay back against the dirt, eyes on the wide sky where storm clouds still drifted like ghosts. Sleep would not come, only the knowledge that dawn would bring their final reckoning. The prairie was hushed at dawn, as if the earth itself held its breath. Mist rose in the grass, veiling the ground where shadows of the night still clung. The soldier walked slowly into the open plain, each step deliberate, each breath heavy with the weight of what he knew must come. The storm had passed, the outlaws were gone, but the promise between them remained. She was already there. She stood on the far side of the field, her sword loose at her side, the light of sunrise turning the blade into fire. Her hair whipped in the wind, her face pale but steady, as if carved from stone. She did not move until his boots ground to a stop opposite her. The space between them was wide enough for a dozen graves. It felt like the land itself had shaped this ground for them. For a long time neither spoke. The wind stirred the grass, the sky stretched endless above, and the earth seemed to wait. Finally she raised her sword, its edge catching the sun. Her voice carried across the field, low and sure. This ends now. He drew his knife, steel flashing in the morning light. Yes, he said, it does. Then silence broke into violence. She came fast, her blade arcing high, her cry sharp as the crack of thunder. He caught the strike on his knife, sparks scattering. The force rattled through his bones, but he held. She pressed forward, blow after blow, her fury pouring into every strike. He moved with grim steadiness, deflecting, sidestepping, answering with cuts that sliced close but never struck true. Steel rang through the dawn. Her strength was relentless, but he was patient. He let her burn her rage against his guard, each clash a test of will. Sweat ran down his neck, blood from old wounds seeping through the bandages. Still he stood, still he fought. A sudden twist. Her blade cut his cheek, hot pain spilling down his jaw. He staggered back, but his eyes never left hers. For an instant he saw not an enemy, but the same grief that lived in his own chest, the same ghost driving her hand. She lunged again, sword thrusting straight for his heart. At the last breath, he caught her wrist, their bodies colliding, blades locked between them. They were so close he could feel the heat of her breath, see the wild light in her eyes. Neither yielded. The struggle broke in a violent shove. She fell back a step, her balance faltering. He struck then, knife sweeping upward, knocking the sword from her grip. It flew into the dirt, quivering. She froze, weaponless, her chest heaving. He stood over her, knife raised, his own breath ragged. The moment stretched, a single thread between life and death. The land seemed to wait, the sky itself leaning closer. But he did not strike. Slowly he lowered the blade. It slipped from his hand, landing in the mud with a dull thud. He took a step back, opening his stance, leaving himself bare. His voice came rough, cracked by more than exhaustion. I will not kill you. Her eyes widened. For the first time, the sword in her heart wavered. She reached down, fingers curling around her fallen weapon. She could have ended him then, one stroke, and the prairie would drink his blood. But she did not. Her hand trembled. She lifted the sword halfway, then stopped, her gaze locked on his. And what he saw there was not mercy, but choice. A hard, deliberate choice born of everything they had endured. The storms, the blood, the ghosts of dead who pressed on their shoulders. At last she dropped the blade. It struck the ground, sinking deep into the wet earth. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle cry. The prairie seemed to exhale, the mist lifting, the sky opening brighter. Birds rose from the grass, startled into flight, their wings flashing white against the sun. He closed his eyes, chest burning with something he could not name. Relief, grief, hope. When he opened them again, she was still watching, her face unreadable, her sword left buried in the soil. Neither spoke. Words would have broken what the silence had given them. At last she turned. Her steps were slow, steady, carrying her away across the plain. Each stride seemed to draw her deeper into the horizon, until her figure blurred with the land. He did not follow. He could not. Their paths had crossed, clashed, and spared each other in ways no one else would ever understand. But the prairie had chosen to keep them apart. For now, the soldier bent, picking up his knife. He looked once at the sword she had left standing in the earth, the blade catching sunlight, shining like a marker of the choice they had both made. He left it where it stood, a monument to a battle that ended not with death, but with something harder, restraint. He walked toward the opposite horizon, boots sinking into the wet soil, the sun warming his face. The ghosts were still with him, and always would be, but for the first time they did not feel so heavy. Somewhere out there, she carried her own. Perhaps one day their paths would cross again. The land breathed with him, wide and endless, the voice of the prairie whispering through the grass. It would remember their blood. It would remember their mercy. And it would hold the silence of 2 lives spared, carrying it forward into the stories yet to be told.